Hey, it's Dre, and we'll be talking about piercing needles today. There's a lot of disagreement in the piercing community about which needles you should be using and what you can use, if at all. But I have both of them with me today, and I'm ready to talk to you about the difference between the two. I'm going to introduce these two while they're still in their packaging. Let's start with the cannula needle. So, cannula needle. When you look inside the packaging, you see a whole bunch of plastic. That's because the way this needle is designed, when you put the needle in tissue and you pull it out, there is a plastic sheath that remains there so that you can use it for transfers. In a sense, when you're using this needle, you're never fully doing it freehand. There's always that little extra bit of support. However, for reasons I'm going to explain later, this is my less favorite of the two. Number two, we have the American Tri-Bevel needle. When you look inside that packaging, it really is just that packaging. There's nothing extra there. This is my favorite of the two. Whenever you're using this, you've got much more of a freehand technique. This part is just my opinion, but freehanding sounds scary unless you're really comfortable with it. People who freehand find that they have a lot more control with a freehand technique. Now I'm going to open these needles for you, and I'm actually going to show you the structure of the needle, which will let me explain why I have a preference between the two. So first, here's our cannula needle. You'll get this, and when you're ready to use it, you pull it out of its plastic sheath. You'll see the needle kind of pokes out at the end, but there's plastic covering it. And when you're finished with your piercing, you can pop that right off. Here's your needle attached to this, and this plastic sheath remains in place. You can connect this plastic sheath to your jewelry or to your tapers, and it allows for a pretty seamless transfer. And it clicks back in like this too, so that's a pretty nice design. Now I'm gonna unpackage the American Tri-Bevel needle. Okay, so I'm in the middle of editing. I realize I'm calling it an American Tri-Bevel without explaining. So it's called a Tri-Bevel needle. However, in Europe, everyone calls it an American needle because it's less commonly used everywhere else except for America, even though all these other parts of the world have access to it. It's very American in, I guess, the way that people perceive it here. So that's why I'm calling it that. Continue. So you've just got this bad boy right here. There's nothing extra to it, like there's not much to explain or show you. This is about 2 inches long, and the bevel on it is pretty long as well. So let's talk about the first major difference between these needles. Sorry, I'm holding my camera, so it's a little shaky, but look at the difference in the size of those bevels. Now, to give it some credit, the American Tri-Bevel here is a 14 gauge, and the cannula needle here is an 18 gauge, so that is a pretty significant difference in thickness. However, this difference in bevel is still massive. The difference in the size of that bevel is actually a really big deal when it comes to the client experience and the ease for the piercer when it comes to actually doing the piercing. The longer that bevel is, the sharper the needle is. And the sharper the needle, the smoother the piercing. That short bevel is going to have to tear through skin in order to make the piercing hole. Whereas that super sharp bevel is going to slide through like butter. I've had a lot of experiences, me personally, where I've seen people do navel piercings with the cannula needle and it be incredibly difficult and painful for the client. Whereas with my Tri-Bevels, I usually get the, oh, that barely hurt. That was almost nothing. Wow, you know? And that customer experience is a really big deal because who are we doing this for, really? On the other hand, it's also a lot easier for me to use equipment that doesn't require so much force and pressure. That needle's gonna slide through, so I can really focus on what I'm doing. Whereas with the cannula, I'm focused so much on the pressure of the piercing, and it's not a very strong structure needle because it's got all of these mechanisms. I have a hard time gripping it. Yeah, I just much prefer a Tri-Bevel. Can you tell? There's also another complication that comes with the catheter needle. By the way, these are also called catheter needles, cannulas or catheters, whatever. So there is a size difference in the thickness between the needle and the thickness of this plastic sheath. Of course, because the sheath is around the needle, so of course it's going to be thicker. That creates kind of a dilemma. If you pierce with the same size needle as your jewelry, this sheath is going to make the hole bigger. So if I use a 16 gauge catheter and I put in 16 gauge jewelry and I take out this plastic sheath, the piercing's bleeding and it's kind of a mess. It's a pretty big difference. I know it's only like, what, a 0.3 millimeter difference, but that's enough to make a client bleed enough. On the other hand, you can use an 18 gauge catheter needle and pierce with the 16 gauge jewelry. However, you are stretching your client. Now, A lot of people find that to be the easier solution. The client's not bleeding, the piercing looks a little bit better afterwards. However, that stretching experience is uncomfortable for your client. And unless you're telling them that, you're stretching their piercing without their consent in a way. So that gets a little like murky water because I don't know, it's a lot to explain to your client. This just seems like so much more work from an ethics standpoint that I really don't prefer using it. My last complaint about the catheter needle is how fragile it is. It bends very, very easily. So if you're trying to focus on, let's say, doing a really thick piercing and you're putting all this pressure on it, sometimes your piercing's not accurate because you're wiggling a bit. This is a lot harder to control than that stiff tri-bevel needle that is not going to bend no matter what you do. So why do people use the catheter needle? Well, first, there is a big issue with accessibility. There's a lot of parts of the world that don't have access to tri-bevel needles, at least to a reasonable extent. You have to run a business. So if shipping these needles from somewhere costs you an arm and a leg, it's just not feasible for business. Those places won't be able to stay open in certain parts of the world. However, keep this in mind. In America, Canada, the UK, and the EU, these are accessible. I don't know where you're watching this video from, but just keep that in mind. The second reason that people might more likely use the catheter needle over the tri-bevel is because of the health department in their city. So I know that in Amsterdam, where I'm located right now, the health department prefers you to use the catheter needles because it's less of a poke risk for the piercer, so you're not cross-contaminating. Now, if you do your piercings correctly, you're not going to poke yourself. However, I see what they mean, because if you go through a piercing, right, poke, you can immediately dispose of this, insert jewelry, insert equipment, do things without the needle around. To a certain extent, yeah, you are reducing your poke risk. However, a good professional would know how to reduce poke risk regardless. So that's the end of the video. You guys decide, are you gonna use the catheter? Or are you guys gonna use a needle? And if you're a client, I definitely recommend that you go see a piercer who uses not only tri-bevel needles, but like high quality ones. I like stiletto. I just feel like they're so sharp and they're so smooth. It really does make a difference. And I pay extra for those. Like the quality on them is worth the cost for me. So I guess what I'm trying to say is come get pierced with me, baddie. You know, you'll be taken care of. I got you with the tri-bevel. Anyways, this video needs to end. Bye guys, see you in the next one.